stars of animation are shining. It's time to stay tuned. And now, here's your host, Phil Mackey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another new episode of Stay Tuned Live. It's an all-new live stream talk show presented to you by Streaming the Magic right here on Facebook every week. My name is Phil Mackey, and I'm an animator, cartoonist, and former Disney cast member, and it is my pleasure to be your host each and every week as we deep dive into the world of animated films. Before the show starts tonight, I'd like to tell you guys about a little place here on Facebook where you can connect with other fans of this show and tap into the latest news from animation around the world. It's the Stay Tuned community page, and you can be a part of it right now by simply going to facebook.com/groups/Stay Tuners. Okay. When we think about the classic animated films from Disney, we probably think about the characters. But they're characters that they interact with the environment around them. And that environment could take the form of spirits, like in Brother Bear, or smoke and fire, like in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or even exploding rockets and snow, like that found in the finale of Mulan. My guest tonight has had his hand in all of those elements and more. Please welcome visual effects animator Jasno Francoeur.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, Jasno. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about all the things that go boom and bump on screen.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Yeah. So, I guess we can get right to it. I think, many people know at this point that Disney has taken their animated features primarily into the computer. But when you were working on films like Mulan, those effect shots, those were created mostly by hand, right?
I'd say 90%. Definitely there was a lot of hybrid procedural kind of technology that was just being engineered. And oftentimes the technology that was introduced in one film would be perfected in the next film. So for instance, in Lion King, they were using for the first time herd behavior, simulated herd behaviors. This was even really before The Hobbit. And that was a challenge, taking that sim technology, bringing it into Hunchback for the crowd simulations, and then using it for the Hun charge in Mulan. So some of these technologies had direct impact on what we did, and sometimes it'd be more of an ancillary impact. But definitely effects animators, I would say, tend to be a little more cerebral. I don't want to say intellectual, but more cerebral, because they tend to get really mired into shape language, into details. And there is an acting performance, so to speak, but it's different than character animation. Now, everyone who was at Disney, at the studio that you visited in Florida, or that you worked there, yes?
I did work there at the Disney Hollywood, what they're called now, the Disney Hollywood Studios. Back then it was still MGM, but yeah, I worked there for a little while.
Yeah, and what you said is true. I think most people, when they think of animation, they're very character-centric, which is great, because that's all of our entry into Disney kind of came from character. All of us did the character internship. But then usually in the last about 3 weeks of that internship, you have the opportunity to explore other ways of telling stories. And as you mentioned, you can tell a story with an environment, whether that's a static environment like layout and background painting, or whether that environment is interactive in the case of visual effects. Other different places that you can go as opposed to character animation would be storyboarding. Obviously that's a very popular one. Yeah. There's a lot of different silos, I would say, within the production spectrum.
Okay. And you mentioned the crowd scenes a moment ago from Hunchback, and if memory serves correctly, those crowds were computer generated. I remember kind of noticing that they were kind of these 3D, almost from the Virtua Fighter video game kind of a feeling.
Yeah, and in no way to criticize or denigrate the effort on that film, But
No.
I think that was because if you think back on crowd scenes in old Disney films, like say Cinderella, at the very end, it's literally just a held cell, just like a background painting, right? So I think there was a real attempt to bring more life and more subtlety into that. However, you never want a background scene to kind of upstage your main characters. And I think what they had kind of discovered doing a post-mortem on that film was that maybe those characters were a little too active. Maybe their cycles were a little too transparent. And so that's why I'm saying, like, sometimes you'll develop a technology and then you realize, hey, we really need to, in the next film, hide our tracks a little bit better. So Hans Bacher, who was a production designer on Mulan, that was exactly his mandate, which is if we use 3D, if we integrate it, it's still got to look 2D. So we went to great lengths to do just that. So when that crowd sim was used for the Hun behaviors, as opposed to the Huns repeating the same behavior over and over, they would have 3 cycled behaviors. And then if you copy those Huns and then you stagger the different behaviors, it's almost impossible to tell that any of them were simulated, or even the horses.
But I mean, at that level of variety, is it even saving time to simulate them?
I don't think when you get to the level of Disney or a Pixar, I don't think saving time is ever a mandate. But the reason why these movies cost so much money is because you're paying for the opportunity to iterate. I mean, you could also say you're paying for the opportunity to fail, but fail has a pejorative kind of context. I think it's better to say we have more opportunities to try different things. And whereas if you're working, say, television, those very, very constricted budgets, much more constricted timelines. Or if you're doing direct-to-video, we had an Australian studio that did a lot of the sequels, which, to be clear, we did not. Most of those sequels that you saw were done by the Australian studio, which is not feature animation. It was Walt Disney Pictures, but they closed that studio down as well. But we used to have another studio in Paris for a while that was helping us out. So they first started on Hercules. They helped us out a lot on that film. We inherited, once they began to move over, we inherited some of those animators like Bolem Bashiba. We brought him over to be the head animator on Jumba, on Lilo and Stitch. And then he kind of stayed. And then after that, he had a very successful career at Pixar. So he made the transition from the 2D to the 3D.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And while we're on the subject of crowd sequences, I kind of want to call just in for comparison, The Emperor's New Groove. There's this sequence where Pacha loses the Emperor in llama form, and he's looking around the town. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you guys were using some kind of a replicator on 2D character crowd sequences. Is that correct?
Well, one really popular thing in animation, although, again, you have to hide your tracks, is doing reuse animation, right? So repurposing similar. So in this case, I'm not sure, because that picture was really being generated out of California, and we were just kind of helping them. As you and I were talking before the show, it was called Kingdom in the Sun.
Yeah.
The director, in fact, it was more of an epic kind of a sweep, and the director was Roger Allers, who had worked with Rob Minkoff on Lion King. But yeah, the Disney decided that they wanted to change the demographic. You never really want to change a production when you get into it, particularly, it's like a messy divorce, right? Because there's a lot of money that's being spent. And in this case, about a third of that film had already been in production. So it's no easy thing to go and say, we're going to change the story, we're going to change the whole tack. And I have to say, we were very concerned at the time because even though it wasn't a homegrown project from Florida, you get attached to every project that you work on.
Sure.
And all the artists, including, as you had seen in the documentary, Sting, like they had to very gently tell him, hey, we're only using one of your songs as opposed to the whole thing that you created.
And it's even a truncated version of that song. I mean,
correct. So that's always a really dodgy proposition. And I have to say that I was not happy that they had changed the demographic to the SNL kind of crowd or aesthetic, and none of us were happy with the new name. But the funniest thing is oftentimes you don't really know when you're working on a picture how it's going to pan out. You really don't.
But it's rarely that dramatic, though, right? I mean, I know there's been a few that have sort of shifted gears, but I mean, that's not the norm.
No, not at all, because it's too expensive. So when Lasseter was interviewed at Pixar, they said, how is it that everything that you do is a hit? And he said, because we can't afford one failure. So I think you have to be leery of being a studio that's so big that you can afford a failure, because maybe you'll start having them. But Disney also did the same thing with Home on the Range. I think what had happened was Disney just started staggering too many productions, and they started digging into the vault and taking out scripts that had languished for a long time. So like Atlantis, Treasure Planet, and not surprisingly, those movies did not generate, while certainly Atlantis has a fan base, at the time they did not make a lot of money.
Treasure Planet's got a fan base too.
Yes, I mean, because they're well made. they're well-made films, but I think the mantra with Disney used to be story, 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 and then that slowly kind of evolved into, well, maybe we can rush some things into production, and unfortunately, it's on the pre-production side where you need to spend the most time. So if you look at, say, like Coco, or really, it doesn't matter whether it's CG or not, any film that goes through their pipeline, most of the time will be pre-production, because the production itself only takes about 2 years, depending on how big your crew is, sometimes 1. And then so maybe 6 months post-production, but it could be 4 years in pre-production.
Wow.
So a long time.
I mean, you're laying your foundation. You're right. That is the most important part. I would agree. So was there a moment or a film that you watched when you knew that you wanted to kind of go more towards the effects side of things?
Well, I think that those seeds were planted when I was a kid. So I'd have to back up and talk a little bit about my background. So I did not grow up with the TV. My parents were hippies. So I remember getting kicked out of Bambi because we did not have shoes. So we had to come back with shoes. But it was that movie. That was the movie.
Well, Bambi didn't either. I mean, that should have been okay. Bambi was just hoofing it.
I know, exactly. You think that we're just one of the animals of the wild. But yeah. At any rate, a few things really left their mark on me in that film. Most notably, the fire sequence was really a very frightening and very dramatic scene. Obviously, the death of Bambi's mother was very traumatic, even though diegetically all this stuff happens off screen. And then, of course, the shifting of the seasons and watching the leaves blow and then watching the leaves fall in the water, those things all left very much an impression on me. And I would say, definitely growing up, I always drew, and I definitely was more character-centric. My stepmother was a relatively famous ceramist. She was very known for her patterns and for her glazes. She passed away about 10 years ago. May she rest in peace. But Vicky Borick was her name, Vicky Borick Francoeur, and she was very famous for just the depth of complexity of her patterns and her glazes. And I think that really left a huge impression on me, just in terms of the love of shape symbology and shape psychology. And that was something that I really kind of rediscovered once I got to Disney, when I was doing my final assignment, which involved a kid getting a laser gun for Christmas. And so the gag was that he was going to shoot the family cat, but I had no idea how to animate the ray gun. So I was told to go talk to this guy named Barry Cook. And as it turns out, Barry later became the director for Mulan. He was an effects guy, but he was also a fledgling director. He was one of the first directors to do a hybrid 2D, 3D integrated film called Papa's Rockers. I don't know if you've ever seen this film.
I've not seen that. No.
You should Google it. Yeah, it's certainly dated by today's comparisons, but it was very, I would say, bleeding edge at the time that it came out. And so I remember going to him and saying, "Hey, I don't know how to do this." And he got very excited that someone was interested in his world, and he gave me just stacks and stacks of all these beautiful drawings, and that's actually where it started. But the funny thing about animation is it's as you know, because you're an animator, it's maximum effort, minimal return. And as I always say, making anything animated, whether it's a short or whether it's a movie, it's like trying to build the Taj Mahal out of toothpicks. It's what's the saying? If you like laws, sausages, and animation, you don't want to watch any of it being made, because it can be an ugly process. Because there's a quantum leap between watching a movie and making a movie.
It's a wonderful thing if you get to be the audience.
Correct. And I think the curse of being an animator is you're so close to the films that you can never really enjoy them because you're just so hypercritical.
Well, but we can. I mean, that's fair. But I would say we get to enjoy them in a more intimate way, in a way that, you get to know. If you marry someone, you get to know that person really well. You know what I mean?
Correct. Yeah. It's a deeper form of understanding the craft.
Yeah, exactly. Or in this case, I would say maybe not marry someone. Maybe it's like having a child, basically, and you watch that child grow and grow and grow, and you're like, I know you. I remember you when you were nothing, and I will kick you out if you don't behave.
Pretty much. But I wouldn't say initially the animation bug did not bite me until a few months into my career. And in fact, I almost felt like I had made a mistake. I was like, wow, there's an aspect to animations that's very tedious. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of trial and error. Yeah. But a couple things changed my, two things changed my opinion. I would say, first and foremost, being in California, I had access to the Disney Vault. And a gal that I was dating at the time ran the vault, or she was one of the people who ran the vault, with the white gloves and all that. And so I went there, and I had them pull all the drawings from Sleeping Beauty from the dragon sequence.
Oh man!
And I just remember just being flabbergasted at the quality, just the sheer quality, and also the fact that a lot of these artists are almost nameless, But it's just art for art's sake, People really taking the time to make something perfect. And of course, back then they had much longer production schedules. They didn't have to rush. They didn't have deals with Burger King, or there weren't other extenuating financial aspects that were getting them to rush to market. So they were even more thoughtful, I think, than we were, because they had the time to be. And that left a huge impression on me, because I was like, if there's anything that I want to attain in this life, whether it's whether or not there's a name to be associated, or whether it's just staying anonymous, but attaining that level of craftsmanship, you can spend half your lifetime just trying to get there. And that really impressed me. And then the second thing was going to dailies, because it's one thing to see your work, but you don't understand how it's cut into the movie, and you don't see it in continuity or even in color until you go to dailies. And that's when I finally got it. That's when the light went off. And it's like, all this hard work you did, now it's here for you to enjoy in this very transient moment. And it's cut in such a way that it's just real time.
That's kind of evoking in my mind the idea of everybody holding up a pillar at a different part of the plot of land, and then at one point you all turn around and you see if the pillars are all holding up the structure above that.
In a way, yeah, absolutely. And so, gosh, I mean, I got into the business when I was I interned when I was 20. And then I started working when I was 22. And then I got out of the business by the time I was 34. And I wouldn't maintain that. I mean, a lot of us had a choice to make when the studio closed. Do we want to continue in this business, but more in the 3D realm? For me, I think my biggest love in animation was the drawing aspect of it. And I didn't want to leave that behind. And so it's one of the reasons I kind of parlayed my career choices into going more into teaching, because I knew that I could at least still wield a pencil and I could still draw. And so that was the impetus. And we did train. A lot of us trained for about a year before the studio closed. But I would submit that maybe 50% of the people took to it and the other 50% not, because they are in many ways different mediums. You're still pushing shapes, you're still telling stories, but the pipeline is very different with 3D, because once you make a 3D asset, it exists in perpetuity from whatever angle you rotate it, or let's say it's a simulation. But the simulation, of course, in 2D is in your mind. You're only limited by what your hand and your mind can express.
Yes, which is just I think to me the part that, like you said, blows you away when you look at some of those older sequences where those guys didn't really have anything to look at.
Correct. Yeah.
They were inventing the medium, and it just is amazing.
That's exactly right. Yeah, they were kind of inventing it as they went along, and so it was always a joy to go to the vault and to pull drawings. And but it wasn't always like that. I mean, there wasn't. Sometimes I would be equally shocked by if I went deep enough into the vault and say I pulled some drawings from Snow White. they literally were inventing the wheel then, and so they weren't nearly as specialized. So yeah, there was still some questionable, like, I don't know if this would pass muster today, but
Sure.
nevertheless, they were inventing it, and that's the difference.
If we could, I'd like to look at a sequence from Mulan here and talk a little bit about. So every film obviously has its own visual style.
Yeah.
And so what I think is kind of interesting, like for example, Hercules uses a lot of spirals and swirling motions, and Mulan does too for that point. But so this eventually, a film style will make its way even into the effects.
Correct. Yeah.
And what film can you? I mean, first of all, if you want to tell us anything about this sequence, that's cool. But also, I'm wondering, what movie did you work on where trying to adapt things that you knew like have a certain behavior, like smoke and fire and water? Where did the style of the film kind of mess with physics in a way that you kind of had to rethink things?
That is an excellent question. In fact, I don't know that I've ever had that question, but it's one thing I always try to tell my students. Like a movie like this, the style, even for the characters, it's deceptively simple. But just by adding an arabesque, just by adding a concentric circle or any kind of swirly, not only does it add to the budget, but it does just what you said. It interferes with the physics, and you have to do a lot of viz dev, and you have to rapid prototype and go back and forth between the drawing and the animation, and there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. But it's a logic problem that needs to be solved. Oh, by the way, this is a big money shot here where the rocket goes into the mountain. That's Garrett Wren. He was one of the lead animators on this sequence. We would often say a scene like that would be like a level 5. Level 1 might be more like a lighting scene. But there were a lot of David Tidgwell was the head of effects for this film, and he brought a lot of innovation to the entire thing. Really learning how to keep the mandate of Hans Bacher, where we really wanted to integrate the 2D and the 3D. But also, because of the style of this film, we didn't have classic tones in the same way that we would, or highlights with other films. So that they had to, through caps, they had to figure out a way to utilize the line work and make it feel almost like a watercolor painting, or almost make it feel like it had depth, because typically there are other tricks for doing that. So again, the style created limitations, but it also opened up these new vistas. But I think of all the films, maybe that's why this film was the most rewarding, because that style, it was not easy. It was not easy to do, and we had a whole year of visual development before we started animating. But it's not really till you start animating that the style actually gets solidified.
Okay. Yeah, and I, like you said, going back and forth with the physics thing, it's almost like you have to reinvent a set of rules for, in this world, this is how this object would behave.
Right. Well, so it's funny because I just gave a lecture this afternoon, an online lecture about, I think one of the similarities between what we do and character animation, or character animators do, is the importance of silhouette. But we have another layer of complexity in VFX, which is the internal silhouette. So you've got kind of, because you have a lot more overlapping actions in VFX, so there's a lot more to consider. And this is from Brother Bear. Brother Bear, like Lilo, was not nearly as complicated, just because the style was a little more raw. It wasn't highly stylized. You always knew going in on any particular picture what you were in for. So, for instance, Lilo and Stitch, you knew there was going to be like a lot of science fiction effects. Whereas Brother Bear, because it's a period piece, you knew that there would be some magic, but otherwise everything's going to be a lot of just naturalistic, like glaciers calving,
Sure.
Storms, rapids, a lot of rapids.
In this case, you have some sort of spiritual effect happening, which, I mean, what do you even use for reference in that case? Because it isn't like you can go outside and watch the spirits coming out of the sky.
Correct. Well, so a couple of things.
I mean, I don't know where you live. Maybe you can do that. Maybe out there.
So a few things about the sequence. So Joe Gillen worked on a few of the scenes. Jason Wolbert did a lot of the particles, and he was even nominated for an Annie for a lot of the work he did on this film. Darlene Hadrika Then she was the walked point on after he touches this magical pillar. It opens up into the Aurora Borealis, and so a lot of that is CG with 2D elements. So she kind of walked point on that. And of course, we had James Garfield, who was a really good VFX TD. One thing I want to impress is that even if I say, yes, I was the supervising animator on the sequence, so many hands, there's so many people who work on this, because you've got your assistants, you've got your breakdown artists, your in-betweeners, you've got the people doing the color keys, you've got your background painters. So you can never really say, oh, that scene is mine. It's really much more socialist than that. It's one of the things I love about the art form is it's very collaborative. But in terms of magic is really just normal based visual effects with physics that are colored differently. So if you go back and look at that column of magic and how it is like he's wading in water. Well, technically it was water.
You mean right here? This
yeah.
part?
So if you look at the internal particles or the earlier establishing shot where I did the particles with the Sharpie of all things. But the point is that if you add pixie dust and you give it an extreme coloring and a glow, it's magic. It's that simple. Just add pixie dust.
I like that answer.
Yeah, but this was a very fun sequence. The director was, you're friends with Travis Blaze. His brother was our director.
Yeah.
He had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do on this film.
That's very
and he has a love for animals, right? Like and that really comes through in the film.
Gotcha. So I mean, was there something specific for each? I mean, there's different effects happening in this sequence. So were you referencing natural phenomena in order to make, besides the Aurora Borealis, anything else?
Well, anytime you are doing a sequence like this, there's always happy accidents, as we would say, the trouvé, the lucky find. You happen upon things in production. But I would submit that the overarching sensibility is, yes, let's study the Aurora Borealis.
Like that right there, that effect right there, that almost looks like a flame, or I mean, there was some. Yeah,
so Bob Bennett, I believe, was the animator on that scene. Actually, Bob is still with Disney. He actually was an early embracer of Houdini, so he kind of stuck with the company. And this is Gary Snyder, who worked on this sequence. He's now at Ringling. It's funny how many years go by, but you never forget who worked on what, because
that's impressive.
You live with these scenes, right? You live with these scenes. But no, this whole sequence. What was interesting about it is that there were a lot of innovations on the film, and kudos to Aaron for really pioneering this kind of more muted palette in the beginning, and everything was 35 millimeter. But once Kenai transforms and we see from his POV, suddenly the world is colorful, like the Munchkins and Wizard of Oz, right? And then suddenly it goes from 35 millimeter to CinemaScope. I remember being in the theater and then suddenly watching the curtains come out, and that was really interesting. I really appreciated that, just as someone who loves film as well. I'm not just an artist, but I do love live action film. And so, yeah, and then the whole palette of the film changes completely. Then it's much more vibrant, much more colorful.
I like that you mentioned live action film as well, because I mean, there's this sort of gosh, I've heard it said before, if you can do something in live action, why would you do it in animation?
Why would you animate it? Yeah. Well, that's a fair question. And I don't think that Disney always answered that question, because like, to me, I think Pocahontas could have been very much a live action film. I don't necessarily know that it needed to be animated, whereas there were some artistic choices. I think Mike Gabriel was a great art director. I think there were some interesting color palettes and some interesting choices, but in that case, they were keying off of the Virginia woods being very rectilinear. So in the same way, Sleeping Beauty was looking at the regal kind of static nature of tapestries, medieval tapestries, and trying to build that into the animation. But you always, that's a very tricky thing, because rectilinear designs and shapes don't necessarily lend themselves to flowing animation. And so,
but you want to ground it. I would imagine, like, there's got to be this sort of sweet spot where you do want to ground it in reality so that it feels like it could happen. But then there needs to be, I mean, not needs to be, but it's nice if there is something that is beyond what would be in a live action film.
Well, let me be more specific. I think because of the nature of that film, they felt compelled here and there to do some type of rotoscoping. And I just don't, I think rotoscoping tends to rob the vitality out of a scene. I think animators tend to, if they're flying blind in a way, there's more opportunities for happy accidents. And again, this is just my opinion.
The only rotoscoping I've ever really been a fan on is Take Me On or Take On Me.
Oh, Take On Me. Well, that was kind of that was everyone's introduction. Well, before that, of course, if anyone followed Ralph Bakshi and, his version of Wizards or Lord of the Rings or, but he used rotoscoping in a way that was different, I suppose. And there have been some companies like, and this is interesting because I had a choice between working at DigiPen, the DigiPen Institute, or working on a film called A Scanner Darkly. And A Scanner Darkly, to me, did not answer that question you just asked, which is, why is this animated? Because they essentially made the film 2 times.
Yes.
They shot it live action, and then they rotoscoped it, right?
Yeah. And there are some other, I won't name them, but there are some other projects being produced currently that do the same thing. And I understand that it looks cool, but why are we doing it?
Well, I mean, to me, it's never a time saver because there are different things that you have to resolve with that. And it's not necessarily, you can't just have someone trace per se. You're still interpolating the information. Yeah. But I've just never been a huge fan. I just noticed that rotoscoping tends to deaden the life in things. And I can see how you could do it for character. I'm really curious as to how anyone would rotoscope a crashing wave. There's just too much information.
Sure.
You still would need someone to understand how to traditionally animate.
I think it betrays the rest of the film if you don't do it the entire time.
Correct. Yeah. And this happened with a lot of films. I mean, Titan AE, I don't know if you remember that film, Fox Studios. And Titan AE was another movie that ILM got involved, and there was rotoscoping. It was just a hot mess because it was like, well, what is this? Is this 2D? Is it 3D? Is it hybrid? And I think that boils down to art direction, which brings us back to Mulan. The reason why Mulan is so interesting is that Hans Bacher really, really was manic about making sure that the film maintained its look, that it did not deviate or wander into anything that might remotely look like a different style or suddenly being too reliant on CG. Okay.
That's important then. You got to have someone steering the helm who's got that vision from the very beginning on the onset.
Absolutely. I mean, we always have art directors, but the production designer is, he's pretty much the most important person, walking point, and keeping the visual language the same.
Then how is that different from the director then?
Well, so it's funny because I have a lot of students or prospective students and I say, well, what do you want to do? And they're like, oh, I want to be a director. I'm like, are you sure you want to be a director? Because do you even know what a director does? And frankly, I think that sometimes you can get promoted to the level of where you're no longer boots on the ground. You're no longer, you don't have your hand on it. It's really tons of meetings. And tons of people just asking your opinion, but you get one step removed from maybe what your passion was, which was animating in the first place. Now, Disney did try to at least on every film have the directors. There was always a scene that they would get to animate, but their time was very, very compressed. They spent half their time in Sweatbox, half their time promoting the film, and so oftentimes I would look at directors. And usually directors are mined from story, but sometimes they come like Barry Cook from other departments like VFX. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, is it Chris Buck? I'm trying to remember which other. There was another Disney animator who had also come from VFX. Sometimes they pull them from layout, but usually story. Story and animation are usually the people who gravitate more toward the direction. But those directors still have to be very strategic in who they hire to be their art directors, production designers, etc., because there's so many moving parts. It's like an orchestra. They're the conductor, but you still have to have the person playing first chair, violin, still has to be damn good. You still need your virtuosos. You still need third chair piccolo. There's a place for everyone at the table, but the conductor still has to be mindful of how he is coordinating those efforts.
That makes a lot of sense. I like the analogy for an orchestra. You said half the time the director spends in the sweatbox, was just to clarify. That means they're spending their time reviewing footage that's already been created and then kind of re-steering everybody back on track?
Well, it could. I think Sweatbox could be just about. So I was very lucky a few times to be able to be in some of those sessions, and so this is what a Sweatbox session might look like. So definitely the director, in this case on Brother Bear, like Aaron, he's steering the ship, but he's got a lot, different captains from different parts of the ship that are all different and all important. So, for instance, someone who's a representative of VFX, someone who's a representative of audio dialogue, someone, Foley, someone who is walking point on the layout. And everyone in Sweatbox has an equal opportunity to make comments, but the director will always default to the person whose area of specialty it is. But at the end of the day, he can default to his own opinion because whatever he says goes anyway. But so, for instance, a scene might come up and someone might be talking about, well, I think the dialogue is slipping, but he's going to listen to the person who's in the audio team before he listens to some other opinions. So yeah, these are various scenes from Lilo and Stitch. I worked on the surf sequence, and I don't know how to surf. I've never been on a surfboard in my life. Studied a lot of Kelly Slater. And then, of course, this is an interesting scene. This was originally a 747. We had to go back and change that because 9/11 happened right as we wrapped up that sequence. And then this scene, originally, he had put his hand into the blender. We had to go back. Chris Sanders' vision was much darker and much more violent, so we had to tone everything down. So in this sequence, Jumba and Pumbaa Pleakley, wrong movie. Pleakley are trying to actually kill Stitch and not trying to kidnap him. And then, of course, Beauty and the Beast I had mentioned. This is the Human Again sequence. This was a song that was later put back into the film. So
that makes more sense, though. They it's not to change something, but that they were trying to kill Stitch. That actually makes a lot more sense.
Oh, it's even darker than that. There was an original part of the storyboard where he takes Lilo and uses her as a human shield. So I think it kind of deepens the trajectory of his character from kind of this heel to someone who's redeemable. This was a film, John Henry. This was directed by Mark Henn, one of the great 2D animators that came out of the Florida studio. And I was one of the senior animators on the film. There were two styles. One was the subset style was this quilt style, which is kind of more graphic. And then there was this other style, which is more Harlem Renaissance. So we were actually going straight into coloring the roughs. There was really no cleanup phase.
And you can see it. It retains that raw texture.
Yeah, it's got a looseness to it. But it's hard to make as paintable shapes that don't pop. So, and then of course my very first film as an animator was Pocahontas. So they threw a lot of this kind of stuff at me. A lot of magic leaves. I'm anti-gun, but I've done my fair share of weapons.
That's fair. We all got to do the things that we don't necessarily want to do. By the way, that John Henry animation, that's available on the Shorts collection, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's called American Legends.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I do want to remind everybody before I forget that in a couple minutes here we're gonna, if you don't mind, Jasno, have a little bit of Q&A with the folks watching at home.
Absolutely.
But before I get to those questions, and by the way, if you're watching live right now, feel free to start putting those in the comments, and I'll get to as many as I can. I wanted to talk about, you mentioned that you're teaching now, and you're with, of course, Roger Rabbit comes on right when I'm talking about something different. I'm the huge Roger Rabbit fan. Anyway, but you're working with DigiPen, which is a college in the Pacific Northwest, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's been around for about 30 years, and the school has about 9 different programs. I represent the art side, and so in fact, I think one of the interesting things is that over the years, at least 9 animators and background artists and different people from different parts of the production pipeline have in fact either worked for the company or are currently working for the company. And this included when I was setting up our brick and mortar in Singapore. I had guys like Woody, who was teaching storyboards. Woody Woodman. I know it's a great name, but Woody, he was a former Marine, so coming over to Singapore was like just shipping out for him. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we had the brick and mortar. After 3 years in Singapore, I helped set up the program in Spain. And so there are a lot of European animators I was pulling from through some of my Disney contacts. And it's really interesting to see the difference between the campuses. It's kind of a value proposition, the different kind of storytelling that students have in America versus, say, Europe versus Asia. A lot of the films coming out of the Asian market almost always have some kind of a kung fu fight or some kind of martial arts or some kind of really extreme fight sequence, whereas the stories coming out of the European campus tend to be much more, I don't want to say meandering, but existential, not necessarily having a strategic goal or point. And I think in America, we're really hung up on like a punchline, right? It's like, let's just cut to the chase. Like, where's the gag? Or something has to be happening at every minute. But I think there's room for everything under that tent. Like movies like The Red Turtle, to me, like very French, a lot of space. I myself probably would err more away from the commercial side. I love a lot of films in Annecy, for instance. But as I said, I mean, there's a market for everybody.
That's true, and that's a really good point about Western storytelling. I feel like we are obsessed with asking the question, but why did that happen?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's not a good question to ask, but I feel like we get, like, if you look at Eastern storytelling, it's more about getting caught up in the magic of the moment and not necessarily about explaining it away.
Correct. Well, it's like I think with a lot of European filmmaking, it's kind of like the ineffable mystery. And it's more about the journey or about a tone poem, whereas in a more commercial film, and that's really all I've worked on anyway, there you have a very specific beat chart. And of course, as you know, you can have a beat chart for everything from story to you can have a beat chart for editing. You can have a beat chart for your color scripts. I mean, there's nothing in the film that isn't a science to a certain degree.
Very true. What smoke were we just seeing there, by the way, that purple smoke?
So a lot of the animation you're seeing here in time-lapse, believe it or not, this is all stuff I've done on my iPad, including that. Actually, the samurai animation I did in Japan, because I do a lecture series there, but it's just a character series. I really kind of embraced digital mostly these days. I'm still drawing traditionally, but I'm drawing on my iPad or I'm drawing on my Cintiq. And so what this is, in fact, I did this last year just on the counter behind me. I usually stand when I work, and this is all done on the iPad. So I was really just wanting to test out how far I could push Procreate as an animation tool and as a coloring tool. So a lot of this animation, and I wouldn't recommend this for anyone unless you're experienced. A fair amount is straight ahead, but I think straight ahead only works if you really understand timing.
Straight ahead?
Yeah, as opposed to pose to pose, as opposed to key to key.
Right.
So each one of these sections will start with animation, and then you'll see here actually some of this was animated traditionally, and then I just scanned it in, and then I colored it. So in every case, I'm not really painting. It's really more just flat color. I'm not really getting too deep into dimensional painting just because I didn't have time. So a lot of this is actually also for my students. It's really great to be able to front load through asynchronous learning all of your materials in time lapse. That's the beauty of the iPad, is that it allows you to have complete transparency with your process. So this is what I call massaging the line. And all these, I've kind of already worked out the basic shape and the basic timing. But the second pass is really just nailing down. Remember, I was saying those internal silhouettes become just as important as the exterior silhouette in VFX.
Sure. Massaging the line, you mean like messing with the line thickness and things like that?
Everything from line thickness to what you'll find in the cleanup phase is oftentimes you'll be redesigning as well. So I do a fair amount of redesigning when I get to the cleanup stage. But you do something long enough, it's not really you that's doing it; your hand does it. So this eventually will be an animation. This is just a still of it's a wave demo. And so what you'll see here is I always start with
waving. I thought you wanted me to do a wave demo.
Very funny.
There you go.
As you see here, I always start with the rough gesture, and then I go into defining the line hierarchy. And so I'll kind of knock stuff back, and then I'll dig back into it. But in a thing like a crashing wave, you have smoke language, you've got obviously wave language, you've got water language, fire language. It's almost like you have to, in order to do a level 5 scene, you kind of have to be mired in the basics. You have to understand most shape language. And then this is...
would you say that you're fluid in a number of languages?
Oh, and this is very interesting, because then when you get to something like an avalanche, which here you saw that I keyed it up. So I animate with a Sharpie when I animate traditionally, because it forces you into not getting precious with the shapes. It just forces you to push them. And then, of course, here what you're seeing is I'm in-betweening with Procreate.
Oh, nice.
I kind of used the tool in a way that it probably wasn't meant to be used. And then on this pass, I'm doing the tone. So I'm defining those interior silhouettes.
But when you're making those things, are you looking at like a video of an avalanche, or are you just thinking about this stuff?
It's all in my head.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible.
Well, because the thing you have to understand is that when, well, first of all, I've been drawing my whole life. I spent, 5 years in art school, another 8 years just training to get to a level where I could even do a level 5 scene. And by that point, you've looked at so much reference. You have kind of like this inner arsenal, like this. You already have all the video reference you need. It's in your head. And I think at that point, looking at too much reference can kill it. That's why I'm saying rotoscoping is the enemy of animation life. And I always feel like I get much better results if I just charge into it. Now, that said, when I lecture, I do pull up images like this, and I'll show students, like, this is how I pull out those salient shapes. But then when I do this, when I'm doing these sketches, I'm not looking at any reference. But in order to animate, you have to be able to draw like this first. You have to be able to understand the form and the function before you get into animating. And then one more time, here's the beauty pass on that one. So, and forgive me, it's a little choppy just because obviously we're not streaming over, like, say, YouTube. So if you guys do, I don't know if you want to put this into the chat, but the link that I sent you, which is on YouTube, also for the DigiPen Academy, and then you can actually see the animation.
I can probably do the link to what we're watching right now.
Yeah.
I can probably do that. I think I know how. Maybe.
And then also the other link that I gave you, the one with the 3 mini classes, the one on how I actually did that avalanche, working from the gesture to the block and then eventually to the color. There are 3 7-minute kind of mini lessons. And then the rest of this is actually, this was a lecture that I had prepared for the master class. And I was asked by the moderator, can you talk about some of the technical challenges? And we've already actually talked about this. We were talking about the crowd sim and Hunchback. So a lot of this was kind of presaged by that conversation. But yeah, it was just repurposing old technology. Sometimes you will lose these, as the form develops, a lot of this stuff gets lost. So for instance, in the old days, like in Pinocchio, if you wanted to create the sense of turbulence or caustics underwater, you had a thing called ripple glass. And it was a very expensive piece of glass. It was like $30,000. And you essentially would move it one increment at a time, as you would like on ones across the image, and it would create turbulence. Well, you can do that now in After Effects, or you can do this with a simple caps function, right? So a lot of those, what were nascent technologies, are now dead technologies. But it doesn't matter, because it's the same type of visual storytelling that's being told. It's just being told with a different medium, and that's why I never like to get into the weeds about what's better, 3D or 2D. I mean, I prefer 2D because I love to draw, but I can really appreciate really, really good 3D animation.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a place for all of it, I think, as well. But yeah, I mean, we definitely have our biases, I think. There is a question that was in the room. I'll bring up here. We might have already answered it, but I'm going to just address it anyway. So Victoria was asking, what is Sweatbox?
Okay. Well, interestingly, that documentary that you and I were talking about is called Sweatbox. It is. But it derives from back in the old days.
Yeah.
Disney had created it's kind of like a think tank where, in this case, it would be him. He would be in the room with the director and the other principals. And it's an opportunity for everyone to objectively look at the work and to make comments. Every company has their version of Sweatbox. Like Pixar For the longest time, they've had a running policy where all the animators watch the dailies together and they critique each other together. So that's a form of sweatbox. It's a more specialized sweatbox. But it literally is like being in a small room with all the different principals and being able to brainstorm about how to make something better, or whether or not something is working, whether or not it needs to go back to the table.
How intimidating is that process, even though they're your peers? Is it a little bit like standing up and forgetting to wear underwear that day?
That's very funny. Yeah, like and my worst nightmare. No, I think it's like with any career. If you do it long enough, it's your day in, your day out. There's not really a fear attached to it because it's just part of the process, and you know damn well that the first time you do something is not going to be the only stab at it. Like you know it's a process. What you learn early on is you learn how to animate quickly, so you can get something in front of the directors so they can give you feedback. What you never want to do is get terribly complicated and show them a near finished piece of work. That's the kiss of death, because in general they'll probably say no anyway. And different directors work differently. I really enjoyed working with Chris Sanders and Dean Dubois on Lilo because they had a very particular vision. They were very unequivocal in what they wanted to see. And I knew that if I could just get a real fast rough in front of them, that would be more just like a conversation starter. But invariably, that animation would change many, many times. And it also depends on the scene. On Lilo and Stitch, I worked on what became eventually the title shot. We didn't know it at the time, but it was actually the very first scene where Lilo had been animated and we composited it together. One of my jobs as an effects animator is also compositor. So my job was to get everything, all the different levels, compose these very complicated exposure sheets. Sometimes it would be 1,000 levels deep. And then I would work specifically with the scene planner, who's kind of like the cinematographer. And it was a back and forth.
1,000 different layers of elements?
Easy. Many of the scenes that you saw from Mulan, like that fireworks sequence, easy, more than 1,000 levels.
And they're all moving independently of one another and...
Well, some of them are caps ops. So, for instance, you might say, well, the smoke, I want the smoke to interpolate from hot to cold or vice versa. Maybe I want another level where I'm adding a blur. I want another level where I'm adding a transparency. And each one of those is a column. Each one of those ends up being kind of like its own discrete column. So, of course, cells, you couldn't do that because you could only get 6 layers deep in a cell before losing resolution. But if you're talking about, and this is a problem too, I've often told students, I think you've got to limit your palette. You've got to figure out what tools you feel comfortable with, because in any program, whether it's Maya or you name the program, Photoshop, you only use 10% of its functionality, if that, because there's not enough time to use the rest of it. And you'll figure out how to use it in the way that works best for you. So I think sometimes, I'm also a musician, and I see a lot of corollaries. I kind of have a holistic idea about art. And to me, I see a lot of similarities when things went from analog to digital and audio engineering. It was the same issue. It was like suddenly everyone's throwing in 100 different plugins, whereas in the past you couldn't do it because you just didn't have the bandwidth to add all that. A plate reverb would take up half a room. So what you get is mud. So you have to be very careful that you don't create too much noise.
Well, wouldn't you say at earlier stages in the development of our tools, when there was less of them effectively, wouldn't you say that people were finding ways to make those limited number of tools push as far as they could?
I mean, that's what you do with any technology. And so, it's funny because people always assume that if you have any kind of an innovation, it somehow speeds up the production process. And it's just the other way around. It's no faster. If anything, I think maybe it takes longer to make a movie with the fidelity of, say, Toy Story 4, which blew me away. Just the rendering alone and the lighting were just incredible. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't save time. Because once you create a tool and you're like, wow, look at that result, you're like, well, what else can we do with this tool? It opens like a Pandora's box.
So you understand that, and I'm sure a lot of other animators understand that, but it seems like that, correct me if I'm wrong, but the executives never really got a handle on that because that was the reason for transitioning away from 2D, correct?
Yeah, I think they had kind of this myopic view that that somehow 3D was just what audiences wanted, and therefore, which I thought was very short-sighted. And I do think that Netflix is very instrumental in bringing back this kind of form of storytelling. I to me, it's all everything's equal under the sun. If your story is best told with stop motion, then tell it with stop motion. If your story is best told with shadow puppets, then use shadow puppets. But 2D is a very particular medium. There's certain things that you can do with this medium that you cannot do. Now, I will say this: when we saw Toy Story coming down the pipeline, there was a little bit of a concern because we were like, well, certainly they haven't reached the level of fidelity, visual physics, and the snappiness and the elasticity of 2D. Well, they've achieved it now. Actually, I think Incredibles was the watermark. That was the movie I remember seeing it, thinking this feels 2D. It had a 2D sensibility, which makes sense because Brad Bird was a 2D director.
I kind of feel like to go a little bit away from Disney, I felt like they nailed it with I don't know if you've seen it, but Hotel Transylvania 3.
Well, I've seen the first two, so I'm very familiar with. Is it Tartakovsky?
Yeah, once they got to the third iteration of that series, I don't know what changed behind the scenes, but it's like they figured out how to make everything in 3D feel like a limp, wet noodle that you could just. I mean, but it's amazing to look at.
Well, yeah, same with Claudia with the Chance of Meatballs. I think.
Yeah.
So Sony. One of our former teachers who actually attended DigiPen many years ago, Nick Kondo, is now a senior animator who had many of the big money shots in Spider-Verse. And I thought, to me, of all the films that I've seen, that was the movie that was the biggest watermark in terms of, well, they had a mandate, which is if it's not broken, break it. And I love that. I love this notion of let's do something. So, for instance, like because they wanted it to feel like a comic book, they weren't using motion blur. So how can you create parallax, or how can you create motion blur if everything's in super high resolution? So some of the solutions they came up with, or even the notion of, as you know, anytime you move a camera, it's on ones. So in the old days, they didn't understand this. If you go back and look at Pinocchio, you can see where they're coming out of Monstro's mouth and they get washed up on shore. Those drawings are all on twos, but the camera's moving on one, so it's very stroby. So obviously they had to figure out early on, the characters will slide around unless they're also on ones. And yet in Spider-Verse, they broke that rule. And so they eyeballed it. They just eyeballed it because Spider-Man starts out on fours, like eights, fours, and twos. And as he becomes more aware of himself as a character, he then becomes on twos and ones. So that was, and that was very disjointed for people who don't understand animation. They thought, well, why does this look so jerky? But it was a stylistic mandate. And remember we talked about a beat chart? Well, they made a beat chart through timing. And they said, as our character becomes more self-aware, he goes on to ones.
It's an incredible way to use technique to tell a story instead of just plot. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I could talk to you forever, Jasno, but we've kind of hit our time mark. I just want to make sure I had enough time to say thank you, seriously, for being here and really, opening up at least my eyes to some of the things that. I mean, I feel like we hit the tip of the iceberg, but some of the things that go into just planning and staging and just how deep that thought process goes in animation.
And just remember, like, I'm just working on a very small part of the puzzle, and, we say this at DigiPen. We say that, the industry is not made up of geniuses. There's very few actual real geniuses. Most people who get into this industry are simply people who just want to do the thing. And if there's any maxim that I could leave anyone with is this idea that talent is a throwaway word, like instinct. It's just one of those words that people use that is meaningless.
Yeah.
Because there's this bizarre corollary, or not so bizarre corollary, between hard work, elbow grease, and actionable scenes that move the story forward. And I think anyone can learn this if they want to put in the time. It's like Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, 10,000 Hours.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. without going into too much of opening a can of worms, I absolutely agree that when people say talent, it becomes this dismissive verbiage of saying like that's a thing that I could never do, therefore I'll just call it talent and I'll feel better that it's not a thing that I could approach. But the reality is, like you said, if it's something that you want bad enough and you make it your mission, so to speak, it's absolutely attainable.
Yeah, because to say gifted kind of robs you of all the time you put in. And the thing that I didn't really get too far into is there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this industry. Like you said, having a child, very true. Every time you have a new film, it's well, I've never given birth, but I've seen it, and I tell you what,
oh, my friend, no, I've never had it. I was going to speak from pretend experience. Thank you again, and I hope we can talk to you again in the future. And if people want to find you, obviously you're teaching with DigiPen.
Yes.
They go to digipen.edu, or where can they find DigiPen?
Yeah, you go to digipen.edu, and I'm actually looking here in the comments, and so actually so for instance, Stefan Moody, he's one of our fantastic instructors, not just for foundation, but now for applied foundation. We have a very deep bench. It's like working at Disney, where I know that every day I come to work, my peers are amazing, and it keeps you honest, and it makes it exciting to work there.
Well, hello to Stefan. Thanks for being here. And yeah, he says that he thinks this conversation should be shown at the DigiPen orientation, which I'm not going to stop anyone from doing that. So thank you again, and we'll see hopefully some more of your work in the future.
All right, Phil. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jasno. Bye.
Take care.
Well, everyone, thank you guys so much for being here this evening. And I'd like to take a moment to say thank you again to all of my Stay Tuned patrons. Your support continually encourages me every month. It helps me make it possible to keep doing what I'm doing as an independent creator. So if you visit patreon.com/PhilMaki, you can learn more about the various reward tiers, and you can even sign up right now. Every bit of support truly does help, so thank you. While you're at it, guys, please check out my original comic books at philmaki.com, and be sure to say hi to me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook under the handles of either PhilMaki or Retail Sunshine, which is what you see behind me. And once again, please be sure to join the amazing Stay Tuned community that's right here on Facebook for free daily news from the world of all things animated, and to also talk with some of the folks that were watching this video tonight. So get involved right now, and that's at facebook.com/groups/Stay Tuners. I've been PhilMaki. You've been a wonderful audience, and until next week, keep those eyeballs peeled, those ears open, and be sure to stay tuned.